Hello everyone, welcome to my talk on using systems thinking to make sense of complexity in the public sector. This presentation has been pre-recorded, but I will be keeping track of any questions in the comments section, both on the 10th of March and for a few days after the event. So let me start with an introduction. My name is Marianne Briley and I'm a service design lead at DXW Digital, where I've worked for the last 3 years. DXW Digital are an employee-owned digital agency that works with the public and third sectors. We work in partnership with our clients to make life better for people who use public services and the teams that run them. I actually started my career as a product designer, and over the last 13 years, I have moved through jobs as a design researcher, user researcher, UX designer, and service designer. What I've loved about all of these roles was the opportunity to learn about people and the systems and services they interact with. I specifically enjoy trying to identify the root causes of problems and to help my clients or teams find a solution that addresses the problem rather than the symptoms that the problem creates. I think this is why I tend to find systems thinking useful in the projects I get involved in. I hope this talk will help you see how you can apply it in your work too. A quick disclaimer here. I'm not claiming to be an expert in systems thinking theory, but I do feel I have things to share from a practical project level perspective. So in this session, I'll share how I've been employing systems thinking to help us make sense of or work with complexity in the public sector. So why do we need systems thinking? Well, services tend to operate within an ecosystem of other services, which each bring their own set of interactions and dependencies. When we're working with public sector organisations to develop better services, often one of the first things we need to do is form an understanding of the complex ecosystems we're working within. Establishing that holistic view of an organisation is important when thinking about the impact of any change. It means we can provide properly integrated solutions, avoid operating in silos, and introducing unintended consequences for people using the services. It also enables us to consider how a service might be supported and improved over time. Seeing that bigger picture helps you make better decisions. Thinking outside of your product or service and understanding how, where, and when it fits helps us to design better. It also helps to open up opportunities you may not have considered before. Imagine being in one of these hot air balloons. Looking down on the landscape, you have much more chance of seeing new connections or opportunities than you would if you were searching from the ground. The more we zoom out, the more we understand how to affect change in an ecosystem. We're finding more and more clients asking for systems mapping or thinking in their projects. And I personally think this comes from a desire to have more impact with their work and to make real, lasting change. Drawing on some of my recent projects working in higher education, local government, policy development, and service delivery for central government, I'll share some experience of how to apply different approaches and techniques and what I've learned. I hope to leave you with some new ideas about how to tackle complex problems in different contexts, namely how to turn something complex into understandable, actionable ideas, examples of how to use different systems thinking methods and tools, and finally, using stories to tie things together. If anyone has looked into materials on systems thinking before, you've probably come across this diagram. Whilst I haven't deliberately gone into projects with an approach in mind, I've generally found I make use of a number of these approaches in my work. Most commonly, my projects tend to require interconnectedness, an understanding of how services are connected to other activities, or where they have dependencies outside of the boundaries of the service. Synthesis, taking in complex information, finding trends and patterns so that teams can act on those insights. And emergence and causality, understanding how components in a system affect each other or work to support an outcome, whether that be intended or unintended. Looking back across a few projects, I've been able to break down my approach into 5 steps. So let's begin. Step 1, just like you would with baking, start with a goal in mind. So we've got our buns here. We want to make some buns. Start every project with a clear ambition or a problem statement. What do you want to understand about your service? What will it help you to do? Why is it valuable to the organization or the users to do that? Having a clear goal enables you to explore multiple outcomes and to look at projects with a number of different lenses. Here's an example of a project goal that I found helpful to refer to as the work progressed. It reminds me of what's needed and ultimately why that's needed. Then it links to specific expectations from the client. These expectations were a result of an inception workshop at the start of the project. In these workshops, we take time to dig into the original brief and understand what people want to achieve and why they need to understand or communicate. Note how there aren't any specific outputs required here, such as systems maps, personas, journey maps, blueprints. We chose to focus purely on the outcomes they needed. That is, seeing the bigger picture, understanding impact, visualizing connections. This gives our teams the freedom to select tools and methods most suitable for those goals, and the insights we'll gather from research. Another aspect of starting with a goal in mind is to think about your audience. What do people need to do with the outcome of the work? Who's using it? Are they the domain experts, or are they new to the topic? What do they need to learn from it? What are they trying to achieve? If possible, sketch out some ideas for the output of some research. At this point, this should be super rough and you should be prepared for it to change. But having something tangible to point to is really helpful when trying to understand what people need to learn or how they plan to use the work. Here's an example of a rough outline for a project looking into the cumulative impact of system changes. We wanted to show the human stories of those who will be affected by the changes and help the teams identify who, when, and how support will be needed. Knowing that we wanted to present the insights in this way influenced how we ran our research. In this case, we knew we wanted to show a journey of change over time. So our starting point with research participants was to map out key moments and milestones for these changes, which prompted more detailed discussion about dependencies, incentives, and blockers. Step 2, identify the components in the system. How do they connect? What are the dependencies? Where are the boundaries? What is out of control as an organization? Once you have identified these components, you can start to draft some hypotheses to test. Thinking in this way makes the learnings much clearer. Is something true or false? Either answer is okay, because you've learned something. I'll go into this a bit more later on. Now, I say this as step 2, but it's more than likely that your understanding of these components will evolve as you carry out more research into the topic. Be prepared to draft several iterations of your components and their connections and dependencies as you learn. As Josh said here, it's supposed to be messy. It's quite normal to start a project with a client who already has a whole host of research and strategy documentation to share with you. It can feel quite overwhelming to look through these and know where to focus, because they've usually been written from the perspective of someone who already knows the organization, its culture, and its structure. I can find initially that I take in information without really knowing where it fits or what makes it relevant. One way to approach this is to start with a rich picture. Here you can see an example from a project with the Open University. This picture is a very high level representation of their different teams and services provided for students. I found drawing things out in this way helped me communicate my understanding of their environment. And even at such a high level, it provided context for how students experience different services and how those teams are organized internally. A rich picture like this could help you find that starting point. For us, it gave us a starting point for a research plan, and it helped build confidence with the client by showing what we'd taken away from their documentation. It also served as a useful reminder of how any change in one area is likely to impact on another. Here's another example of an ecosystem built in Miro off the back of a number of early interviews. We were asked to assess the potential for improvement of a well-known and used system in central government service. As we interviewed people, we were able to draft a rough user journey, which is that main blue circle in the middle, and show where other services or systems inputted or extracted information. The red post-its you can see are some of the questions we wanted to answer as the research progressed. This view not only gave us an understanding of the main user jobs and objectives, but also better context for how information entered the system and some of the root causes behind some of the issues identified by users. Already from a few interviews, we picked up patterns around how data was sent between services or where services weren't integrated and needed manual intervention. It helped us to justify who we wanted to research with and why, and what we felt we needed to focus on in the research. Step 3, get it wrong, learn from that mistake. So this is what I mentioned earlier in step 2. As a consultant, we often have very little time to get up to speed on a whole new area. You can jump from one project about how emergency healthcare is triaged to a new project around affordable housing or school inspections. You get well practiced at taking in a lot of information, and you do your best to generate as much understanding as you can in a short period of time. However hard we try, we have to be prepared for there to be some misunderstanding of what we've heard. Just like this cake here, we know it's meant to be a hedgehog, but there's just something not quite right about it. Don't be afraid to reconsider some of your conclusions as the work continues. We can test our understanding through using scenarios to test out connections. How does the scenario play out based on your conclusions? Does it make sense? Does it accurately reflect what you've learned from research? Are there some gaps that you need to look into? To give you an example of how your understanding can grow, this is a small diagram created after a couple of user interviews. We were learning about what a local plan is and aspects which made them difficult to implement. For anyone who doesn't know what a local plan is, These are very long and technical documents drafted by planning officers. They set out a plan for a local area to be achieved over the next 10 to 15 years. The process to develop a local plan requires balancing a range of input and consultations, analysis of a wide variety of evidence and data, and it needs to pass a thorough examination process. Once adopted, a local plan should be used to influence decisions over individual developments in that area. It's a critical part of the planning system that influences a number of different outcomes. This Venn diagram felt so useful to us at the time, and already we felt we were uncovering some good insights. We had three main components, an understanding of how they related to each other, and some insights around what fed into those components that affected behaviours and those in the system. This is how the research looked towards the end of the discovery phase. As you can see, there's so much more breadth, and the findings were sprawling. You can see our little Venn diagram in the top left corner for a bit of perspective. This is a typical result from research synthesis. Findings are grouped into themes, and you usually find that insights in one area have connections to other areas. The orange notes in here are insight themes, and the dark blue ones are what I might consider to be components of the system. For example, resources, monitoring, consultation. The red boxes highlighting different areas. These were areas that we wanted to focus on, or where we felt we had some gaps in our understanding, where things just didn't feel quite right. It can be useful to experiment with different ways of organising information depending on what you want to understand. So here's an example of using a switching forces diagram or a push-pull methodology to organise insights from user research. This approach is especially useful when you're trying to identify what could encourage a change in people's habits or practice. It works by mapping out things that will encourage behaviour change and things that will hold people back from that change. From here, you can better analyse the balance between the two, and if there seems to be more or stronger themes that would hold people back from change, then you know there will be a risk to success. It's also really good at highlighting aspects that people value and aspects that would benefit from some attention and problem solving. This is a great tool to use with a team after some research playback to summarise what you've learned, and it's a really simple way to start making some connections between behaviours and outcomes. I mentioned earlier about how consultants need to get up to speed in a short space of time. So for some particularly gnarly projects where there's a lot of content and complexity to get your head around, I found the input from subject matter experts to be crucial to us developing a thorough enough understanding of the system and how it connects and operates. Subject matter experts are also especially useful when you're dealing with sensitive information or when trying to understand in more detail how changes to a system or service will impact those who use it. They are also fantastic sounding boards to your research approach and research synthesis. We used experts in one of our projects with the Central Gov team to visualise the impact of some new policy. Whilst we did conduct primary research with users, we understandably weren't able to talk about aspects of the policy that weren't yet in the public domain. So our subject matter expert was able to evaluate these changes with us and give us a steer on how that might be felt by users. We use this input alongside our research to provide a form of RAG status, which is red, amber, green, for intended and unintended consequences of the changes. If you have access to subject matter experts, try to involve them in some way, whether it's upfront defining the problem to be solved, in research analysis and synthesis, in crafting a vision for the future, or even as a critical friend. Step 4, collaborate. This may sound like a pretty obvious one, but it's related to my earlier point about being prepared to accept you might have got some of it wrong. Invite subject matter experts to work with you. Invite different teams from the organisation to work with you. And if you can, invite those who interact with the system to work with you. A more thorough and realistic understanding comes from taking in the perspectives of lots of relevant people involved in using or delivering a service. It adds confidence to your findings, and it helps you make stronger connections and recommendations. One example of how you might do this is through some opportunity solution mapping. This is a tool that ensures any ideas arising from research can be traced back to the objectives and outcomes that an organisation is seeking to achieve. The green and blue rows up at the top show the objectives, goals, and opportunities identified in discovery research. Organising them in this way makes it easier to play back what you've learned to a larger group. The red and yellow post-its are the potential solutions and ideas for how they could be achieved. Each of these can be traced back to an insight and an objective, meaning nothing in here should be ignoring user needs or business goals. And from here, you can organise ideas, vote on which to carry forward, and make plans for next steps with the work. It's a really useful tool to do with teams. System thinking isn't only for designers. It's not a practice that's owned by design, but design does bring a narrative to the story. I'd like to thank Elma for this one. It's true that systems thinking is very popular with designers, and it's something a lot of us are talking about at the moment, but it's not something we should claim to be our own. What we are quite good at adding, however, is a story or narrative that ties everything together, which takes me to my next point. Step 5, the final step in this talk, communicate. Communication is crucial. If you can't communicate what you've learned, then people won't understand it, won't remember it, and ultimately can't act on it. It forces us to think clearly about what's a priority from the work, which limits the temptation to provide quantity over quality. Focus in on the bits that really matter. There's only so much detail people can remember. Figure out what message needs to get across and focus on delivering it. As a service designer, one of our favourite ways to communicate is through visual storytelling, be this journey maps, storyboards, videos. Telling a story helps bring insights to life, helps others not only remember what's been learned, but also know why what's been learned is useful and hopefully what they can do to act on those insights. Particularly with systems thinking, a lot of the outcomes of that work can remain fairly abstract and difficult to engage with until you choose a theme to hang your insights from. To give you an example, one outcome of systems thinking was what we called the story of land. In this particular example, we've been doing research into the planning system. There were other outputs from this project that went into a lot more detail, but we felt something was missing to tie our learnings together. Anyone who's experienced the planning system will likely know that there are a myriad of different routes, actors, and processes involved. In order to get the key insights across, we chose to craft a story of a piece of land traveling through the planning system. We chose scenarios that allowed us to highlight the aspects that users wanted to focus on or had the most issue with. From this piece of work, we linked back to more detailed outcomes. We used the story of land as a hook to help the client engage and know where to look first. Storytelling is also brilliant for describing a future service and the problem it can solve. Here is an example from one of my colleagues' healthcare projects. They used a common scenario identified from their research and to demonstrate how a new service could operate and the problems that that service would solve. These sketches were accompanied by detailed descriptions of what's happening to help people follow the story. Storyboards help our insights feel relatable. They help us show how humans are at the center of the solutions, and they create a strong link between the problem to be solved and the potential solution. A storyboard like this one appears high level, but it provides an engaging starting point for teams. It offers people some context to make sense of more detailed documents such as process maps, user personas, user needs statements, wireframes, and others. So that was the 5 steps of systems thinking that I've learned through practice and experience. I hope you can see that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. When dealing with complexity, we need to keep our goal in mind, be prepared to pivot on that goal, and choose the most appropriate methods to help us organize knowledge and insight. From there, we need to craft a story that helps make it memorable and clearly articulates what the system needs in relation to the project objectives. I should point out that all of these examples I shared today were not the end point for any of these projects. They mark a moment in time where we saw value in sorting our information to form conclusions or hypotheses. What I've shown are the tools we use to organize our findings and thoughts in order for us to move the work forward. When thinking about systems, we need to have a continuous awareness of the impact on connected services. We need to be willing to come at problems from a number of angles, and we need to be open when testing our hypotheses. Often systems thinking goes hand in hand with planning for the future. So whilst we may get to a point of understanding how different components connect, it's not possible to predict exactly how triggers or events will play out in real life. We can, however, use our understanding to design and maintain better services long term, provided we are continuously open to learning and adapting what we know. So to recap, here are my 5 steps to dealing with complexity through systems thinking. 1, start with a goal in mind. Think about who will use the outcome and the best way to communicate with them. 2, identify your components and the connections. From here, you can form a plan for what to focus on or research with. 3, research, iterate, be kind to yourself. It will take a while to feel like you've found everything you need to know. You may make some mistakes as you go, and that's okay. 4, work with others, value different perspectives, value subject matter experts to give you a leg up, value that critical friend who can test your understanding. And 5, communicate so that others know how to get involved. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it's been useful. Please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to discuss any of these ideas further. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to learn more about DXW, you can find a series of case studies and blogs on our website, dxw.com. As I said at the start, I'd be happy to answer any questions in the comments section. Thanks again for taking the time to listen today.